Karen and her husband Brad are boarding a flight when she spots something that doesn't sit right with her. A black woman comfortably seated in first class. Convinced there must be some mistake, Karen demands she switch seats. But what starts as a simple dispute quickly spirals into a whirlwind of shocking revelations. Because this woman isn't just any passenger. She knows Brad. And what she reveals will leave Karen speechless. By the time this flight lands, relationships will be tested, secrets will be exposed, and Karen will learn a lesson she never saw coming. Stick around to see how it all unfolds. And if you love stories with unexpected twists, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. Also, where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. We'd love to know. Karen stood firm, gripping her designer bag tightly. "Miss, I think you made a mistake," she repeated, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is first class." The black woman, Ava, remained calm. She reached into her purse and pulled out her ticket. "Actually," Ava said, holding it up, "this is my seat." Karen blinked. "That can't be right." The flight attendant, a young woman with a professional but firm demeanor, approached. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Karen huffed. "There must be a mistake. She can't possibly have this seat." The flight attendant took a look at Ava's ticket, then at Karen's. Her lips pursed as she turned to Karen. "Ma'am, your seat is actually in economy class." Karen's face went pale. "What? No, no, no. That can't be right." She grabbed Brad's arm. "Honey, tell them we paid for first class." Brad rubbed his temple, clearly embarrassed. "Karen, The flight attendant tapped a few buttons on her tablet and nodded. "You're in 27B. Karen's jaw dropped. 27B? That's in the back. "Yes, ma'am," the flight attendant confirmed. "Please take your seat so we can depart on time." Ava watched the scene unfold with mild amusement. "Looks like there's no mistake after all," she said, adjusting in her seat. Karen turned to Brad, her voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "Why am I not in first class?" Brad sighed, avoiding eye contact. I didn't buy first-class tickets for us," he admitted. Karen's mouth fell open. "What do you mean? You told me you got an upgrade." Brad swallowed hard. "I only got one upgrade and I used it for myself." Ava chuckled softly, unable to hide her amusement. "Wow," she said. "That's awkward." Karen's face turned red as she looked between Brad and Ava. "Why do you think this is funny?" she snapped at Ava. "Do you two know each other?" Brad's silence was deafening. Karen turned back to him. "Brad?" Ava smirked. "Oh, he knows me all right." The entire first-class cabin fell silent, curious eyes watching the confrontation unfold. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I need you to move to your assigned seat now." Karen, flustered and humiliated, had no choice but to turn on her heels and storm toward the economy cabin. But even as she sat down fuming, something about the way Brad and Ava looked at each other gnawed at her. Who was this woman? And why did Brad look like he had just seen a ghost? Karen sat stiffly in seat 27B, her arms crossed in frustration. The hum of the plane's engines barely drowned out her seething thoughts. She glanced at Brad, still seated in first class next to her. That woman Ava was too comfortable, too confident. Something wasn't right. Karen pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll, but her eyes flicked toward the first-class cabin. She could see them talking. Brad wasn't just making polite conversation, his body language was tense, his hands fidgeting. Guilty. Brad never fidgeted. Karen's stomach tightened. She pressed the call button. A different flight attendant approached, a polite but firm smile on her face. "Yes, ma'am?" Karen forced a tight-lipped smile. "I need to switch seats." The flight attendant glanced at her tablet. "I'm sorry, but first class is full." Karen's eye twitched. "I don't care about first class, I want to sit next to my husband." The flight attendant hesitated. "Unfortunately, we can't make adjustments once boarding is complete." Karen's nails dug into her palm. Fine, she muttered, dismissing the attendant with a wave. She turned toward the small gap between the seats, angling herself to eavesdrop. Ava's voice carried back just enough for Karen to catch. Snippets. Still surprised to see you, Brad. Brad exhaled sharply. Yeah, it's been a while. Karen frowned. A while? Ava's tone was playful, but there was an undeniable sharpness beneath it. Didn't expect to run into me like this, did you? Karen's grip on her phone tightened. Yeah, well, Brad muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Life has a funny way of throwing surprises at you. Ava chuckled. It sure does. Then came something Karen didn't expect. Ava leaned back, took a sip of champagne, and laughed. Karen's pulse quickened. This wasn't a random woman. This wasn't just someone he met once. Ava knew Brad. Brad knew Ava. And more importantly, he was nervous around her. Karen's fingers flew across her phone screen as she opened her messages. Karen, who is she? She stared at the screen, waiting for the delivered notification to turn into read. Nothing. Karen's eyes snapped up, watching Brad as he shifted in his seat. His phone was in his lap. He had seen the message. He was ignoring her. Her patience cracked. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stormed toward first class, her heels clicking against the floor. The same flight attendant appeared out of nowhere, stepping in her path. Ma'am, you must remain in your seat during takeoff. Karen forced a smile. It'll just take a second. Ma'am, but before the flight attendant could stop her, Karen had already leaned over Brad's seat, her voice sharp. Brad. Who is she? Silence. Ava didn't look the least bit surprised. In fact, she smirked, resting her chin on her hand like she had been waiting for this moment. Brad, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to melt into the seat. Karen's heart pounded as she took in their expressions. That's when Ava finally spoke. You mean he hasn't told you? The word sent a chill down Karen's spine. Brad ran a hand down his face. Karen, please, but Karen's voice cut through his weak protest. Told me what? Ava held Karen's gaze, then reached into her bag. She pulled out something small, a business card. Karen frowned as Ava slid it onto the tray table in front of Brad. Karen's eyes scanned the card. Her breath hitched. Ava Mitchell, CEO, Titan Capital Investments. Her head snapped toward Brad, her mind racing. Ava Mitchell. The name hit her like a slap. Titan Capital Investments. The firm Brad had just applied to. The job he was desperate to get. Ava wasn't just a random woman in first class. She was his potential new boss. And judging by the smirk on her face, she knew it. Karen's mind raced. Ava wasn't just some woman. She was powerful, connected, and clearly enjoying this. But why did Brad look so guilty? What was he hiding? And more importantly, what exactly was his history with Ava? Karen's fingers gripped the edge of Brad's seat. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow. Ava Mitchell. So, the woman sitting next to her husband in first class wasn't just someone from his past, she was his future. Brad finally spoke, his voice low. Karen, please go back to your seat. Karen ignored him. You know her, she accused. Not just from business. From before. Ava smirked. You're sharper than I expected. Karen turned to Brad, waiting for an answer. His silence was an answer on its own. Ava leaned back in her seat, watching Karen with a glint of amusement. Brad and I go way back. Karen's stomach twisted. How far back? Ava's smirk deepened. College. Karen froze. Brad finally sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was years ago, Karen. Karen's jaw clenched. And you never thought to mention her? Ava let out a soft chuckle. Oh, he wouldn't. Karen's eyes snapped to Ava. Why not? Ava shrugged, sipping her champagne. Because he owes me. Silence. Karen's hands tightened into fists. What does that mean? Ava tilted her head. Brad, you tell her. Brad exhaled, his gaze dropping to the business card still sitting on the tray table. In college, he started, voice low, I wasn't exactly on track to succeed. Karen frowned. What are you talking about? Ava answered instead. Brad was failing. He was this close to dropping out. She held up her fingers, barely an inch apart. Karen blinked, looking at Brad. You never told me that. Brad didn't meet her eyes. It's not exactly my proudest moment. Ava continued. I was top of my class. Business, finance, investment strategies, you name it, I aced it. She paused, then smirked. Brad needed help. Karen's stomach dropped. You tutored him? Ava laughed. Tutoring? No, sweetheart. I saved him. Karen's pulse quickened. Ava's voice was smooth, calculated. I pulled strings. Introduced him to the right professors. Helped him land an internship that got his career started. Brad finally looked at Karen. If it weren't for Ava, I don't know where I'd be. Karen's thoughts spun. The husband she thought she knew, the successful businessman, wasn't entirely self-made. He had a past connected to this woman. Karen turned back to Ava, narrowing her eyes. And now you're his potential boss. Ava raised a brow. Funny how life works, isn't it? Karen's breath came quicker. Did you plan this? Ava laughed. Relax, Karen. I don't chase people. They come to me. Karen clenched her jaw. Ava's gaze flickered toward Brad. That job you applied for? My company is very selective. Brad nodded stiffly. I know. Ava swirled the champagne in her glass. And hiring decisions? Well, she glanced at Karen with amusement. Let's just say, I take everything into account. Karen's eyes widened. You wouldn't? Ava held her gaze unblinking. Brad swallowed hard. Ava. Ava simply smiled. Karen's mind reeled. Ava had power over Brad's future. And Karen had just humiliated her in front of the entire first-class cabin. Karen's hands trembled. What had she just done? Ava held all the cards. But was she here to help Brad or ruin him? And more importantly, was Karen about to cost her husband everything? Karen sank into silence. The weight of Ava's words pressed down on her, suffocating and undeniable. Ava Mitchell, CEO of the very company Brad was desperately trying to join, held all the power. And Karen had just embarrassed herself in front of her. She turned to Brad, her voice a whisper. Did you know she was the CEO when you applied? Brad hesitated. That split second of hesitation told Karen everything. Oh my God, she breathed, eyes widening. You did. Brad sighed. I didn't think I'd actually run into her, Karen. It's a huge company. Karen shook her head, barely able to process. And now you're sitting next to her on a 6-hour flight after I just. Ava cut in, her voice smooth. Tried to kick me out of my seat? Karen flinched. Ava was enjoying this. Karen's pride burned. But something deeper, something colder, began to settle inside her. She turned back to Ava. So, what happens now? Ava blinked, feigning innocence. Now, we fly to New York. I enjoy my champagne. You enjoy your economy class seat. Karen gritted her teeth. That's not what I meant. Ava's smile was slow, calculated. Ah, you mean Brad's job application. Karen's pulse pounded in her ears. Ava glanced at Brad, amusement dancing in her eyes. Well, I was reviewing the candidate list this week. I hadn't reached his file yet. She took a slow sip of champagne. But now, he's suddenly very memorable. Brad tensed beside her. Ava, come on. This isn't. Ava raised a hand, cutting him off effortlessly. Oh, Brad, she said, her voice dripping with something Karen couldn't quite place. Relax. I haven't decided anything. Karen's stomach twisted. Ava was playing with them. She could end this conversation right now. She could reassure Brad. She could say, of course, I'd never let this affect my decision. But she didn't. She let the uncertainty linger. Karen exhaled sharply. So, what? You're going to punish him because of me? Ava tilted her head, considering. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Karen leaned forward. Look, I misjudged you. Fine. I admit that. It took every ounce of pride she had to say it. But don't take it out on him. Ava's expression didn't change. Are you asking me for a favor, Karen? Karen clenched her jaw. She hated this woman. Brad looked between them, eyes wary. Ava, I don't want any special treatment. Just review my application, like you would anyone else's. Ava studied him. Fair enough. Silence stretched between them. Then Ava leaned in slightly. You know, she said almost lazily, there is something I'm curious about. Karen tensed. What? Ava smirked. What exactly did Brad tell you about me? Karen blinked. What? Ava turned to Brad. Did you ever mention me, Brad? Brad shifted uncomfortably. Ava raised a brow. No, not even once. She let out a soft chuckle. Wow, that's interesting. Karen narrowed her eyes. Why? Ava met her gaze. Because he meant a lot more to me than I apparently meant to him. Karen's heart stopped. Brad stiffened. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. What? Ava's smirk widened. Oh, she said. He didn't tell you? Karen thought she knew everything about her husband. But Ava just revealed a crack in his perfect story. What else had he kept from her? Karen's breath caught in her throat. The way Ava said it, the casual amusement, the smirk tugging at her lips, made it clear. This wasn't just about a former study partner. This was something more. Karen turned to Brad, her pulse racing. What is she talking about? Brad rubbed his temples, exhaling. Karen, please? No, Karen's voice was sharper than she intended. No more excuses. No more avoiding. Did you and Ava, she swallowed. Were you two together? Brad hesitated. It was a fraction of a second. A blink. But Karen saw it. Ava saw it too. And she laughed. Oh, Brad, Ava said, shaking her head. You're still terrible at lying. Karen's stomach twisted. You lied to me? Brad sighed. It's not what you think. Karen's hands curled into fists. Then explain. Brad finally met her gaze. Ava and I, he hesitated. We almost dated. Karen's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Almost. Ava leaned back, swirling her champagne. More like should have. Karen turned to her. What does that mean? Ava gave a slow, knowing smile. We were close. Really close. Her eyes flicked to Brad. Weren't we? Brad's jaw tightened. Ava. Ava ignored him. But then, poof, he vanished. One day, we were spending hours together, and the next, she snapped her fingers. Gone. Karen's breath hitched. He ghosted you? Ava's smile didn't reach her eyes. Oh, he had reasons. She tilted her head. Did you ever tell her, Brad? Karen stared at her husband. Tell me what? Brad looked down at his hands. It was senior year. I was overwhelmed. Between finals, internships, and everything else, I felt like I was losing control. He paused, voice lower now. Ava was amazing. Smart, driven, and way ahead of me. Ava's smirk softened just for a moment. Brad continued, his gaze distant. I started feeling like I didn't deserve to be around her. Like I was just there, taking up space. He exhaled. So I left. I cut ties. I thought it'd be easier for both of us. Karen's mind spun. You just walked away? Ava let out a dry laugh. Oh, it was definitely easier for him. Karen turned to her. And you never tried to reach out? Ava raised a brow. You think I didn't? Karen looked back at Brad. And you ignored her? Brad ran a hand down his face. I thought it was for the best. Ava's expression hardened. For you, maybe. Silence. Karen felt something bitter rise in her chest. Her husband, the man who always preached about honesty and commitment, had abandoned someone who helped him succeed. And now, fate had placed her in a position of power over him. Ava's voice broke the silence. Funny, isn't it? She sipped her drink. You ghosted me, and now I get to decide your future. Karen inhaled sharply. Is that what this is about? She narrowed her eyes. Revenge? Ava smiled. Oh, sweetheart. Revenge is such a strong word. Karen's stomach twisted, because Ava never actually denied it. Brad made a mistake years ago, and now Ava had all the power. Would she use it? Silence hung in the first-class cabin. Karen's pulse pounded as she watched Ava, searching for any hint of mercy. But the woman before her was unreadable, her smirk playful, her tone light. Yet, beneath it all was something sharper. Power. Karen could feel it. Ava held all the cards. And Brad knew it too. Brad exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Ava, I know what I did was wrong. I should have handled things differently. Ava arched a brow. That's an understatement. Karen cut in, unable to hold back. If you're so upset, why didn't you confront him sooner? Why wait until now? Ava turned to her, smiling as if Karen had just asked the most amusing question in the world. Oh, Karen, do you think I've been waiting for this? She laughed softly. I moved on. I built my career, made my own success. Brad? He was just a memory. She took a slow sip of her champagne, until his resume landed on my desk. Karen's breath caught. Ava smirked. Imagine my surprise when I saw his name. After all these years. She set her glass down. I had two choices. Ignore it or have a little fun. Brad tensed. Ava, she raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. Relax, Brad. I haven't decided anything yet. Karen narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? Ava leaned forward slightly. It means I'm considering my options. Karen's stomach twisted. Ava could reject Brad's application in a second. No explanation needed. She could ruin his chances. And Karen had just given her every reason to do it. Karen swallowed, forcing her voice to stay even. Are you seriously basing this on an old grudge? Ava chuckled. A grudge? No. But character matters, don't you think? She turned to Brad. If you walked away from me so easily back then, what does that say about your loyalty? Brad clenched his jaw. I was young. I made a mistake. Ava tilted her head. And I'm supposed to believe you're different now? Brad exhaled. I am different. Ava studied him, as if weighing his words. Karen knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let Brad lose everything because of a mistake from years ago. Taking a slow breath, she squared her shoulders. Ava, listen. Her voice was measured, controlled. You're clearly successful. You didn't need Brad then, and you don't need him now. Ava raised a brow. Go on. Karen met her gaze. But if you reject his application just to teach him a lesson, that says more about you than it does about him. A flicker of amusement crossed Ava's face. Oh. Karen nodded. It proves you're still holding on to the past. That, despite all your success, you haven't moved on. She held Ava's gaze. You said you're considering your options. Well, here's one proves you don't care. Treat Brad like any other candidate. Be fair. For the first time, Ava's smirk faded. A beat of silence passed. Then, slowly, she leaned back in her seat. A soft chuckle escaped her lips. Well, Karen, she mused, swirling her champagne. I have to admit, I didn't expect you to be the reasonable one. Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Ava sighed, glancing at Brad. Fine. I won't reject you out of spite. Brad exhaled, relief washing over his face. Thank you. Ava smirked. But don't get too comfortable. You'll earn your place, just like everyone else. Brad nodded. That's all I ask. Karen should have felt relieved. But something about Ava's tone sent a chill down her spine. Because Ava wasn't done. Yet. Ava agreed to be fair. But was she about to make things even harder for Brad? Karen should have felt relieved. Ava had agreed to judge Brad fairly. That should have been the end of it. But the way Ava smirked, the way her eyes glimmered with something unreadable, sent a chill down Karen's spine. This wasn't over. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ava, I appreciate it. Really. Ava took another slow sip of her champagne. Oh, don't thank me yet. Karen's stomach twisted. Brad frowned. What does that mean? Ava set her glass down, her gaze sharp. It means I still have concerns about you, Brad. Karen's jaw clenched. You just said you'd be fair. Ava smiled. And I will be. She turned to Brad. That's why I'm giving you a chance to prove yourself. Brad stiffened. Prove myself how? Ava tilted her head. An impromptu interview. Karen's pulse quickened. You can't be serious. Ava ignored her. Titan Capital doesn't just hire people with impressive resumes. We hire people who can think on their feet. Her gaze flicked to Brad. You want the job? Show me you deserve it. Brad inhaled sharply. Right now? Ava shrugged. Unless you'd rather wait for my hiring team to evaluate you without this opportunity. Karen watched as Brad straightened his posture. She could see the gears turning in his head. He couldn't afford to decline. Brad exhaled. All right. Go ahead. Ava smiled. Let's start simple. A client has two investment opportunities. One is high risk, high reward. The other is steady but slow growing. Which do you recommend? Brad didn't hesitate. Depends on the client's goals. If they can handle volatility and have a long-term horizon, the high-risk option might be worth it. But if they need stability, I'd advise the safer investment. Ava's expression remained unreadable. Textbook answer. But what if the client thinks they want stability, yet secretly desires higher returns? Brad's brow furrowed. I'd assess their risk tolerance through a series of questions and portfolio simulations. Ava's lips curved slightly. Good. Karen sat frozen, watching the exchange like a high-stakes chess match. Ava leaned forward. Next scenario. You're overseeing a major acquisition, and news leaks early, causing stock prices to drop. Your team panics. What do you do? Brad's jaw tightened. First, I assess whether the leak was internal or external. Then, I reassure investors through controlled communication, perhaps a strategic press release to manage the narrative. Ava nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against the tray. Table. Not bad. Karen exhaled, barely realizing she'd been holding her breath. Then Ava's gaze darkened. Last question. Brad straightened. I'm ready. Ava's smirk returned. Are you loyal? Silence. Brad blinked. Excuse me? Ava's voice remained casual, but her eyes held something colder. I hire people I trust. People who won't disappear when things get tough. Karen's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. Brad met Ava's gaze, something flickering in his own. I made a mistake back then. I was young, scared, and I handled it poorly. He exhaled. But I don't run from challenges anymore. Ava studied him for a long moment. Then, to Karen's surprise, she smiled. Not a smirk. Not a calculated expression. A real smile. Well, she said, sitting back. That's what I needed to hear. Brad blinked. So? Ava chuckled. So, congratulations. You just passed your first test. Karen tensed. First? Ava raised her glass. Welcome to round 2, Brad. Ava was impressed. But was she done testing him? Karen wanted to breathe a sigh of relief. Brad had handled Ava's impromptu interview well, better than she expected. He had answered with confidence, owned his past mistakes, and even made Ava smile. But something about Ava's last words, welcome to round 2, kept Karen on edge. This wasn't over. Brad, still trying to process what had just happened, ran a hand through his hair. What do you mean, round 2? Ava leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs elegantly. Interviews at Titan Capital don't just test knowledge, Brad. They test judgment. Brad frowned. What are you saying? Ava's smirk returned. Let's say I'm curious. She gestured between him and Karen. You made it clear you've changed, that you don't run when things get difficult. But I need to know if that's actually true. Karen's stomach clenched. And how exactly do you plan to test that? Ava tilted her head. Oh, I don't need to do anything. She smiled. Because the test is already happening. Brad narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Ava's gaze flicked toward Karen. Her. Karen stiffened. Me? Ava nodded. You're Brad's wife. His partner. And tonight you almost cost him everything. Karen's face burned with anger. Excuse me? Ava remained unfazed. Tell me, Karen, if I were anyone else, what do you think would have happened after your little stunt earlier? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew. Had Ava been another CEO, someone with no personal history with Brad, his application would have been trashed immediately. No second chances. No impromptu interview. Karen had almost ruined his shot at this job before he even had a chance. Ava's voice softened, but there was still an edge to it. The question is, Brad, are you the kind of man who lets his wife's impulsive behavior sabotage his future? Karen's chest tightened. That's not fair. Ava ignored her. Because here's the real test, Brad. She leaned in slightly. Would you walk away from an opportunity for Karen? Silence. Brad's entire body tensed. Karen's heart pounded. Ava, stop. Ava didn't. If I told you right now that taking this job meant cutting ties with your wife, what would you do? Karen's breath hitched. That's not, but she stopped. Because Ava wasn't smiling anymore. This wasn't just about Brad. It was about her. Ava was testing Karen, too. Brad exhaled, his voice steady. That's not a choice I would ever make. Ava arched her brow. Interesting. Brad leaned forward. I love my wife. And yes, she acted on impulse tonight, but she admitted she was wrong. That's more than I can say for a lot of people in business. He held Ava's gaze. A strong leader doesn't just discard people who make mistakes. They look at growth. Ava studied him. Karen felt her chest tighten. Then finally Ava let out a soft chuckle. Not bad, Brad. Karen inhaled sharply. Ava glanced at Karen. Something unreadable in her expression. And you? Karen swallowed. What? Ava tapped her fingers on the armrest. Do you support him? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you almost destroyed his chance tonight. Karen's throat dried. She stopped. Ava wasn't wrong. Karen had assumed the worst about Ava from the moment she saw her. She had stormed in without thinking, without trusting Brad. And if Ava had been anyone else, Brad would have lost his chance. Karen clenched her jaw. I do support him. Ava hummed. Then show it. Karen swallowed her pride. She turned to Brad. I'm sorry. Brad blinked, startled. Karen exhaled. I should have trusted you. I should have listened instead of assuming. She met his gaze. And I won't make that mistake again. Ava watched them both. Then, after a long pause, she smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. Ava had tested them both. But had they passed? The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence between them. Karen's heart pounded. She had just done something she rarely did, admit she was wrong. And now, all she could do was wait. Ava watched them, unreadable as ever. Then, finally, she exhaled and leaned back in her seat. Well, she said, her tone lighter than before. I have to say, this was more entertaining than I expected. Karen's stomach twisted. So, was this all a game to you? Ava smirked. Business is a game, Karen. You just learned the hard way that every move matters. Brad's shoulders relaxed slightly. So, does that mean I passed? Ava didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a sip of champagne, savoring the moment. Then, finally, she set the glass down and looked at Brad. I won't lie, she said. When I first saw your name on that application, I almost tossed it aside. Not out of spite, but because I thought, why bother? Brad tensed. But you didn't. Ava smiled. No, I didn't. She tilted her head. And now I know why. Karen held her breath. Ava tapped her fingers against the armrest. You're smart. You're confident. But more importantly, you owned your mistakes. A lot of men in your position would have made excuses or tried to manipulate their way out. Brad nodded. I meant what I said. I've changed. Ava studied him for a moment longer. Then, to Karen's surprise, she smiled, really smiled. Well, Brad, she said. Welcome to Titan Capital. Karen blinked. Wait, what? Brad stiffened. Are you serious? Ava chuckled. Don't act so surprised. You earned it. Brad exhaled, relief flooding his face. Thank you. Ava waved a hand. Don't thank me yet. This isn't charity. Her eyes gleamed. Titan is tough. I expect results. Brad nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. Karen sat frozen, barely able to process. Just hours ago, she had been certain Ava would ruin Brad's chances. And now Ava had just hired him. Ava glanced at Karen. And you? Karen tensed. What about me? Ava's smirk returned. You may not realize it, but you learned something tonight too. Karen frowned. Oh? And what's that? Ava's expression softened just slightly. That your first impression isn't always right. Karen opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Because Ava was right. Karen had assumed Ava was the villain. She had stormed into first class, demanded answers, and nearly destroyed Brad's chance before he even had won. But in the end, Ava had been fair. Tough, yes. Ruthless, definitely. But fair. Karen sighed. Maybe you have a point. Ava chuckled. That's as close to a compliment as I'll get from you, isn't it? Karen smirked. Probably. Ava shook her head in amusement, then turned to Brad. Well, future employee, enjoy the rest of your flight. I'll see you in my office next week. Brad smiled. Looking forward to it. Ava stretched, then pressed the button to recline her seat. Within seconds, she had closed her eyes, completely relaxed. Karen exhaled. It was over. Brad leaned toward her, voice low. I cannot believe that just happened. Karen shook her head. Me neither. Then, after a long pause, she smirked. Well, at least we're flying home with first-class news. Brad groaned. Too soon. Karen chuckled, finally letting herself relax. For the first time all night, everything felt right. Brad got the job. But Karen had one last question. Was Ava really done playing? Karen let out a slow breath, finally sinking back into her seat. It was over. The storm of emotions, the tension, the uncertainty, all of it had passed. Brad had secured the job. Ava had, against all odds, given him a real chance. And Karen, well, she had learned something tonight. She glanced over at Ava, who was now reclining comfortably, her eyes closed as if none of this had ever happened. The woman was a mystery, a force of nature, calculated, powerful, and impossible to predict. Karen studied Brad. He was staring at his hands, deep in thought. Still processing? She asked softly. Brad let out a short laugh. Yeah. A few hours ago, I thought I had zero chance at this job. Now I'm working for a woman I once ghosted in college. He shook his head. Life is weird. Karen smirked. Weird is an understatement. She hesitated, then nudged him gently. You do realize how close you were to losing this opportunity, right? Brad sighed. Yeah. He met her gaze. And I know part of that was my fault. I should have told you about Ava before we even got on this flight. Karen raised an eyebrow. You think? Brad rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I wasn't trying to hide anything. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Karen tilted her head. And now? Brad exhaled. Now I get it. I should have been honest. Not just about Ava, but about my past. You deserve to know everything. Karen studied him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I do. Brad reached for her hand. I won't make that mistake again. Karen squeezed his fingers. Good. For the first time that night, they felt solid again. But then Karen frowned, her thoughts still lingering on something. Ava. Something about the way she had handled everything, It didn't quite sit right. Yes, she had been fair. Yes, she had given Brad a real shot. But she had also enjoyed watching them squirm. Karen glanced at Ava's relaxed expression, then leaned toward Brad. Do you think she's really done testing you? Brad stiffened slightly. I'd like to hope so. Karen narrowed her eyes. You don't sound convinced. Brad sighed. Ava plays by her own rules. Just because I got the job doesn't mean she'll go easy on me. Karen smirked. Would you want her to? Brad chuckled. Not really. Karen leaned back, still watching Ava. I don't think she's done with me either. Brad frowned. Why do you say that? Karen crossed her arms. Because she enjoyed this. She pushed us both just to see what we do. And the fact that she hasn't said a single smug thing in the past 5 minutes? That's suspicious. Brad laughed. Maybe she's just tired. Karen wasn't convinced. And sure enough, as if on cue, Ava opened one eye and smirked. You two do realize I can still hear you, right? Karen rolled her eyes. Of course you can. Ava stretched, sitting up. Relax, Karen. I'm not out to get you. Karen narrowed her eyes. Then why do I feel like you are? Ava chuckled. Because I keep you on your toes. Karen shook her head. Unbelievable. Ava turned to Brad. By the way, you'll be reporting directly to me. Brad blinked. Wait, what? Ava smirked. Oh, didn't I mention that? She picked up her champagne. Welcome to Titan Capital, Brad. We're going to have so much fun. Brad swallowed hard. I feel like that's code for I'm going to make your life a nightmare. Ava just winked. Karen burst out laughing. Oh, this is going to be fun to watch. Brad groaned. Great. Now, I'm nervous. Ava raised her glass. You should be. Karen smirked, finally relaxing. The night had been a roller coaster, but in the end, everything had fallen into place. Brad had a new job. Karen had learned a lesson in trust. And Ava? She had just ensured that this was only the beginning. Life is full of unexpected twists, and sometimes the person you least expect holds the key to your future. What would you have done in Karen's shoes? And do you think Ava will go easy on Brad at Titan Capital? Let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story full of drama, twists, and surprises, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. See you in the next one.